What's up guys, Doug Polk here and welcome back to another episode of Poker Hands, and today we're going to be taking a look at a hand from Poker Goes Poker After Dark between Bill Perkins and Darol Rodrock. I think this is a fairly interesting hand, but more importantly, the negotiation process that happens at the end of it is an important skill set for every poker player to have. So I want to talk a little bit about how to make negotiations when you end up in big pots against different people. But before we jump into the action, I want to quickly announce that Upswing Poker has added a new member to its team. Andres Artanano, otherwise known as Educa Poker, has come onto the Upswing team to teach the most advanced no-limit hold'em cash game course of all time. If you don't know much about Educa, he's an absolute beast when it comes to no-limit cash. This is one of the top 10 cash game players in the entire world. He's won millions of dollars online, has an absolutely sick win rate, and I'm extremely excited for the course we've put together. The course will contain 30 hours of content and will launch on February 19th for $1,000. If you're interested in learning more about Andres as well as the course we got coming up, you can check out the link in the description below. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the action.
Game's going to get swingier if these straddles stick. Single and double on right now.
I don't think so. It's a diagnosis.
Your
fashion may be very loose, but
I'm not going to agree with you on this one.
He's fashioned for
That's point exactly how tight you are.
That was deuce 5. And it really was deuce 5. You might want to turn it over.
I think this table is 100% unanimous that you are the tightest guy.
Bobby, what are they going to say you're tight and you stuck yesterday?
I'm losing today, too.
Yeah.
I'd much rather be playing as tight as you and winning.
In the small blind, making it 3,400 to go.
The thing about tight players is they hate being called tight.
How many times are you going to repeat that?
Our hand begins at 100, 200 blinds with a $400 straddle, so we got some pretty high stakes action going on. Our hand begins with Nori limping into the pot with ace-10 suited. Now, obviously, when you're the first person into the pot, you want to come in raising, build that pot, force people out, and maybe get some value if you do end up getting some calls. However, in this individual instance, it's going to work out for him as the action folds around to Antonio Esfandiari, who looks down at pocket kings in the small blind. Especially facing a limp, there's no reason to get tricky here. You want to bump it up, and Antonio does decide to make a pretty sizable raise. Esfandiari bumps it up to 3,500. This is a big raise, guys. We're talking about 8.5 big blinds over a limp, so you're definitely going to want to be careful in some of the other positions when you're facing a raise that's this big. Perkins gets out of the way, and now in the straddle, Rodrock has an interesting decision to make with Jack-8 suited. Honestly, against a standard open, or sorry, a standard isolation here in the small blind, something like 1,600 or 2K or 2,400, I like calling this hand and trying to play some post flop. But for this big of a raise, I think I'm letting it go with Jack-8 suited. Again, Antonio's going to have to get through both players behind him as well as the limper, so you don't really have to defend too wide. Now, can you profitably call? I think it's close. I don't think you're quite getting the odds. I'd let this one go. Maybe against some weaker players, you could call and you could take some flops or work in a 3-bet and try and bluff. But overall, you probably just have to let this one go, even though that really sucks. Rodrock does decide to make the call, and now the action is back over to Nori. And this spot with ace-10 suited is a much easier call than the one with Jack-8. He's closing the action, so he's guaranteeing a flop. His hand is much stronger, both in terms of its absolute value, but also in terms of his position. He's going to get to go last post flop, see what develops. So I think this is a fairly standard hand to go ahead and make a call. He does, and let's take a flop. I take back what I said about Jack-8. I was wrong.
Check.
Esfandiari picked up 2 callers on the flop, one of whom is Darol Rodrock, who has flopped the nuts. It's Bob Nuri who's betting, though, with top pair. Is $5,500 called by Antonio, and now
Yes, Darol off. Okay, that's right.
Darol is raising it up to 22K.
Bust the pro fish.
22. Patience is the virtue. Winning hand.
Oh, let you go call me. I don't have much left.
A little subtle reminder.
That's all I got, Antonio. Anybody will call you Antonio. Well,
Come on, Amir. Bring this in.
Antonio asking
How
for the
much
5500s to get brought in.
16,500.
So you can see that
16,500.
About 30 grand or something?
16.5 to call.
I mean, if it could go to anybody, it's you, Darryl.
Put me all in?
I like you a lot. You want me to go out?
I don't know. I'm asking you. Look like you'll put me all in while you're picking up those
Would you
25.
like me to?
You look
Say
like
yes.
you wanted to put me all in.
Can you beat one pair?
I'll have to look.
I'm just a poor dumb little boy from Kansas City.
I know my hand's
I've
no
seen this
good.
many times.
Crazy.
This flop is Action City. Everyone's got a big piece. We've got an overpair here with pocket kings for Antonio. We got the nizzles for Rodrock with his jack 8 suited. And then, of course, we also have top pair, top kicker for Nori with the backdoor nut flush draw. I mean, this is a pretty sick situation for all of our players. One of the good things for Antonio is that by raising this large, he puts himself in a spot where he can afford to stack off with some overpairs. Now, that's not necessarily true against Nori because they're so deep, but against Rodrock on most flops where it's undercards, he can feel somewhat decent about getting it in. That's not to say that you should just look to pile in overpairs all the time, but Rodrock has only around 3.5 times the pot left behind. You can't get too fancy when people don't have a lot of bets left behind. You should save those types of laydowns for bigger pots. Antonio decides to kick things off with a check, and I really don't mind this play. I think a mix between betting and checking is fairly good. If you never check hands like kings here, then you won't have some strong hands when you do decide to check. And this is also a board that, you know, there are going to be a lot of tricky runouts for you. If it checks through, you want to be able to have some strong hands on the turn so you can work in some bluffs as well as some value bets. I will say, though, in general, when it comes to good hands, I'm a simple man. I lean more towards betting, getting people out of the pot with equity that can maybe beat you if you just decide to check, and then also getting some value from weaker hands. So I'd probably mainly bet the flop, but I don't mind working on a lot of checks as well. Now, Rodrock with jack 8 suited decides he's going to set the trap as well and checks too. This I'm not a very big fan of. If you want to check the flop with a hand like pocket 10s, I can maybe get behind that. There aren't a lot of other hands that can call you down. You block top pairs that you could get some value from. You block 2 pairs that you could maybe stack. So I don't mind trapping with a hand like that where you really cripple the board. But when you flop the nut straight, particularly multi-way, you want to bet, build this pot, get some value, and you actually have some pretty good removal in that you don't block any of the pairs your opponents could have to call you down. In Rodrock's defense, I guess I like checking this more on a 10-9-7 rainbow board than one with a flush draw. But in general, again, I'm a simple man. Let's bet and build this pot. With 2 checks in front, it's time for Nori to bet with his top pair top kicker, and he's got to feel pretty good about the situation that's developed so far. He decides to bet a little less than half pot. Don't hate this size. I'd like maybe something a little more like 5.5, 6K, but it's also an alright bet size. Now over to Antonio with pocket kings. Particularly against a player this deep, there's really no choice here but to go for the call. If you start check raising with kings here, you're opening up a lot of possibilities that are going to suck. If he 3-bets, you probably just have to fold. If he calls, it might get a little difficult to navigate on some different turns for a massive pot. So I don't think he has much of a choice here but to call. Back over to Rodrock, we see some action now. We got a bet, we got a call, and I think now is a pretty good time to spring the trap. You have 2 potential customers that might be interested in what you're selling, and he does decide to make a raise to 22,000. Now, this size is a bit weird to me because he leaves himself only around 12,000 left behind or so, 12, 13,000. In general, you want to pick a size that sets up a more reasonable bet on the next street. Now, no one can really call you on the flop because if they do, you only have 10 or 12K behind. Either move in, call, or make a smaller raise. I actually don't entirely hate just jamming here and trying to make it look like you might have a hand like Queen Jack for an open ender or King Jack for a double gutter, or maybe even a hand like a pair and a straight draw. So I don't mind a raise here, but I really don't like this size. Alternatively, you could argue that given how big the pot will be relative to his stack, he could decide to just call and let the other 2 big stacks go at it while he just has the pot pretty much locked up. So all I can say is I'm not a big fan of this raise size. I don't mind a jam, and I also don't mind a trap. He does decide to raise to 22,000, and now the action's back over to Nori with this top pair, top kicker. Bit of a weird spot here all in all, especially given that Antonio called. Can certainly have some hands that have you beat, and he decides to make a disciplined and frankly pretty good laydown here with ace-10. He can have hands like sets. He could maybe have a hand like jack-8 suited himself, although it's not too likely to limp in and call a large raise. But he can definitely have some of the sets, or maybe 10-9 suited, and those are going to be much stronger hands to continue with. Back over to Antonio, and I just don't think you're going to be able to continue here with pocket kings. I would much rather continue with a hand like jacks, maybe even a hand like 10-8 suited, and maybe even a hand like aces. The problem with kings as well as queens are you block some hands that could potentially be bluffing. If your opponent is making a move here with their raise, they're going to end up having a hand like queen jack or king jack, and so you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you block those cards that you want them to have. Antonio, however, has other plans in mind.
I don't have much left. You don't have 6-8.
I'm just from Texas. I'm just a dumbass.
I love how he throws out
Sure
the hand
about
that
that?
he cannot have.
Yeah.
Specifically because they can beat him. He always goes, go have this because they can beat him. Like I never had 6-7. I didn't have 6-7.
You are. You can't have
I
chop
am
8.
such a fish. Well, if I'm going to give it to anybody, I'd rather give it to you.
Give it to the foundation.
Shit. One person I don't want calling me is Antonio.
I only have one pair. I believe you.
All right.
He calls.
Wow, Esfandiari makes the
No
call
outs.
and gets a
Antonio
look
has
at
no
jack
outs.
8.
Antonio just got it
No
into
outs.
that. Dead.
No outs.
First time he's checked. How much is it? Go one time.
One time.
Now, before we just go to the run out, I want you guys to pay attention to the negotiation that happens once the turn hits, and then let's talk about it.
Got it in dead. Let's see if we can pick up an out on the turn.
He got it in
Nice
dead.
hand. What?
Twitter is a buzz again.
Oh, he's got outs.
He got out.
They got out. Sure
Yeah.
does.
Three
One
jacks.
person I don't want to call me is Antonio.
You didn't want me to call you there?
Huh?
You didn't want me to
He's
call?
not that
No, I
lucky
mean, I
down.
know I won the pot for a
Wait,
change.
hold on a second. Do you want to pay Antonio any money
To get out?
to muck his hand right now?
I love you, man. Lucky. Put me
No,
on
no,
in.
in the pot. Like you can give him some money out of the pot to muck his hand. Like a rebate.
Sure. I'll take 10.
10
Take 10 out of the pot?
Yeah.
I could give him like.
You still win that, but you just get 10.
I give him 1,500.
Give him 10 back.
I'll give you 5,000.
10, you got it.
You want 10?
Don't do it.
gotta
Don't do
give
it.
him
Don't do
10
it.
grand.
Don't do
Look
it.
at this
Don't do it.
But you get the 20, 30 here. You get that too.
I'll tell you what. I'll do it for 6,000. I'll insure your hand against Antonio winning.
Let me help you. Give him 10,000. It's a huge
No,
pot.
I'll take 6,000. 6,000. No,
Give it to him. Let's go.
What
Well,
are
you gotta
doing?
count it. You gotta see how much that
I'm bringing
was.
less money.
I don't care. I want a pot.
Yeah, you get the pot. But
Yeah, but you could have got 6,000.
You gotta
Show
count
the
it.
last
What?
one just in case.
Jesse, the last card. You got to drop the
You gotta count the stack.
Gotta drop the
This has to match whatever the stack was.
Once the turn comes and Rodrock realizes that he does have a chance to lose, he then ends up in a negotiation situation with Antonio Esfandiari. Here would be my first and most important tip if you find yourself in situations like this. Unless you're very familiar with what's going on, or you're comfortable with the fact that you are risking your opponent making a more informed decision than you, do not engage in negotiating these spots for equity, because seasoned pros will have a much better idea of the equity that they have in a pot. Now, when two pros negotiate, they both know what's going on. They both have a pretty good idea of what the equity is. So in that spot, I think it's a little bit different. But particularly in a situation where you're more of a recreational player, you're playing for fun, I think you should really try to avoid partaking in these types of negotiations with other pro players. It sort of reminds me of the stream that I did last year where I was in a fairly high stakes stud flip. I can't seem to remember the stakes. I want to say it was a 42K flip or something. And then with only a few cards to go, we ended up doing some negotiating. And the line that we set was almost exactly on the mark. Now, that was probably pretty lucky because we were both hammered and definitely don't know the equity on 10 card stud flips, but the point remains, if you don't know what's going on, then don't be afraid to just say no and let him run. I also have to say I'm not thrilled with what Antonio did here. He essentially got paid out 10K of his equity in the pot when his real equity should have been something more in the vicinity of 4 or 5K. You know, really there are only 3 outs left in the deck. Now, we see that 7%, but he can't know what cards are dead. So, you know, realistically, Antonio has about 6% of the 85K in the middle, which is going to put him at somewhere in the vicinity of, you know, 5.5K. So this was a massively plus EV move for Antonio. And while he might argue that, okay, the guy didn't want to lose the pot, I still kind of feel like offering deals that are that bad to people that are playing for fun, it's just not really exactly in the spirit of the game. That's going to do it here from me. And if you're interested more in our Elite Cash Game Mastery course, you can check it out in the description below.